Hey there, I'm Bailey and welcome to my channel where we discuss all the tips and tricks necessary for you to live a life of adventure. It's getting to be that time of year where spring is in the air and everyone is starting to plan their big backpacking trips for the summer, and a lot of people are trying to figure out when the best time to visit Colorado is. I see a lot of people who are, just chomping at the bit because they want to start backpacking and they're asking for trip recommendations for April or May or early June, and it's hard to be the bearer of bad news to say that that's actually usually not the best time to come enjoy Colorado. So this video is going to be all about the best hiking seasons in Colorado based off of the area. That way, those of you who are looking to come for vacation, backpack the Colorado Trail, or thru-hike the Continental Divide Trail, kind of know when you should plan to come through the area. Now, this is all based off my experience. I'm originally from Colorado, lived there 99% of my life, have done a lot of backpacking and hiking in the state, as well as 14ers, that kind of thing. And so I just want to kind of pass on my knowledge to help others who are maybe not familiar with the area. Now, I do want to say before we jump in that if you're looking for more tips and tricks all about hiking and backpacking, then you might want to consider subscribing to my channel. All right, so I am a teacher at heart. That is my current profession. And so before we can really dive into the meat of this video, we need to go over some basic vocab. Because contrary to popular belief, the whole entire state of Colorado is not just straight mountains. And we have some pretty specific jargon that we use when it comes to talking about different parts of the state. So first of all, let's start off with the fact that basically everything east of I-25 is just Kansas and Nebraska. There's no mountains there. It's just plains. So if you are planning on coming from somewhere on the East Coast, you need to know that you're going to have several hours of driving through the plains before you actually get to the mountains when you cross the Colorado border. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, and there's actually a lot of really beautiful plains type hikes in eastern Colorado, so specifically talking about places like Pawnee Butte, the Paint Mines east of Callahan, but it's not going to be your mountain hiking experience like a lot of you are probably expecting if you're watching this video. Now, the second thing you need to know is that the far western part of the state is actually basically desert. So this isn't like quite as big of an area, but definitely around Grand Junction, Dinosaur National Monument in the northwestern corner of the state, those are pretty arid. And while there's a lot of really neat geological features, it's basically just more like Utah rather than like the mountains of Colorado. So it's pretty deserty, and you just need to take that into account if you're planning a trip in that area. But there are a lot of pros to hiking out there. Now, the middle part, like the central western part of the state, is more your typical mountains that you're probably imagining when you think of the state of Colorado. Within that, we can kind of subdivide it into different areas. So if we're talking about the area along I-25, Denver, Fort Collins, Colorado Springs, Pueblo, we consider that area the Front Range. So if you hear someone refer to Front Range hikes, they're usually talking about everything along the I-25 corridor, as well as probably some hikes in the foothills, before you get up to much higher elevations. Now, the weather is going to be similar, but a bit milder in this area, and a lot of hikes open up sooner or more accessible year-round along the Front Range. Lastly, you need to know that the higher mountains that are higher in elevation are harder to reach. We typically refer to that as the high country. Another thing you might hear me talk about along with that is the Continental Divide. The reason why that is important is because the Continental Divide is the line, essentially, that tells us whether snowmelt is going to flow into rivers that empty into the Pacific Ocean or whether snowmelt is going to flow into rivers that melt into the Atlantic Ocean. So this is important because the Continental Divide is usually fairly high in elevation, while there's other mountain ranges in Colorado that are also very high in elevation. It's a pretty good gauge on where we are with our snowmelt. Okay, so now let's go through and talk about when you can hike in different areas of Colorado. So if you are thinking maybe you do want to do a hike in eastern Colorado, I have good news for you. A lot of hikes in eastern Colorado are going to be easily accessible and snow-free year-round. Now, that's not to say that they don't get snow in eastern Colorado. In fact, some of the worst blizzards occur definitely out by Lyman, where it's just really open and the wind just blows really hard and makes really big drifts. But once the snowstorms and blizzards are over, the snow typically melts pretty fast, just because even though it's not as high as the mountains, it's still like 4,000 or 5,000 feet above sea level, and so the sun is pretty strong and melts it pretty quickly. So essentially, just take a look at the weather report. As long as there's not any blizzards going to happen, just happened, then you should be good to go go explore some of those areas, even if it's in the dead of winter. The same goes for the western part of the state. Because it's basically desert, even though it can definitely get cold, especially at night, typically it's going to snow, it's going to melt pretty fast, and then you'll be able to hike like normal. So Think about areas like Moab. A lot of people from Colorado go there for spring break for a reason, and it's because the weather tends to be warmer during the day, and even though it definitely snows, it melts pretty fast. It doesn't stick around very long, and you can do a lot of exploring without it being ridiculously hot like it is in the summer. So you should keep that in mind if you're planning on visiting a place like Dinosaur National Monument. Then just know that if you're planning to go in the summer, it's probably going to be much hotter, and those places are usually better to visit in the spring and fall. So for our front range hikes, these ones again are very weather dependent on the day. I have some pictures at places like Arthur's Rock and Laurie State Park, which is near Fort Collins, where one year it was negative temperatures and several inches of snow, and the next year, almost exactly a year later, it was in the 60s and I was hiking in shorts. And those were both in December. So it really depends on the day. We get some very cold temperatures, especially, beginning of January, and definitely snow in the middle of winter and even into spring. But what usually happens is it snows, it sticks on the ground for maybe a day, and then the sun comes out and it's beautiful and the weather gets warm. And even if it's not as warm as maybe a place where you're from, the sun is very powerful and it makes it feel warmer than it actually is, and it melts. Then you usually have a couple days of mud, and then it's dry, and then it's really nice to hike. And this happens all the way from September all the way through May. You should definitely know that March and April are the snowiest months of the year in Colorado, and so don't plan to have there be no snow then, but know that even if it does snow, just wait a couple days and it will probably be gone. So this is a great alternative if you are kind of looking for that mountain experience, but you're coming sometime other than the peak season in the mountains. Then you might want to plan your trips for somewhere on the western slope or along the front range, where there will still probably be some snow depending on when you come, but it will be a lot more manageable. The temperatures will be better and it will probably melt off and you'll be good to go. So most of you are probably here because you're imagining yourself hiking to some beautiful alpine lake, maybe doing your first 14er, through hiking the Colorado Trail or Continental Divide Trail, and you're like, boy, can we get to the meat of things? Like, this is none of the places I want to hike. When can I hike in the high country? Now, I hate to be the one to tell you, but if you are looking for a completely snow-free experience, then the best time to hike in the high country of Colorado is actually July and August and kind of September. The rest of the time, you can certainly hike in other months, right? You can snowshoe in the winter, ski, especially if you have good avalanche knowledge. You can definitely hike early in the season. You just need to know how to be safe and to know that you're going to be probably post-holing quite a bit. The Colorado Trail Foundation recommends to Colorado Trail Thru-hikers to plan their hikes July 1st. A lot of people try to start earlier than that every year. A lot of people quit because there's too much snow. Most Continental Divide Trail hikers hit the San Juans the first 2 weeks of June, and they do fine, but a lot of those people have more knowledge on how to travel in snow safely. So for example, last year I started hiking the San Juans on the Continental Divide Trail. Around June 5th is when I got up there, and even though it was a slightly below average year and it said that there was not really any snow, you can still see that there were a lot of very large patches of snow. I spent quite a bit of time, especially on the first day, route finding because it was hard to find where this trail was because it was covered in snow, fighting through willows because I couldn't find the trail, post-holing, which is really exhausting, as well as crossing quite a few very steep snowfields that were pretty high consequence. So by that, I mean that if I were to have slipped and fallen, I would have gone way, way far downhill, probably hit my head on something and become seriously injured. The other thing to know with that is when there's more snow like that, there's not very many people out there. So if you choose to go out there, you need to make sure to be self-reliant. I definitely saw only like 2 people within the span of 36 hours. If that tells you anything. So it also tends to be windier that time of year. So it can be pretty breezy up on ridges. Depending on how much snow there is, there can also still be an avalanche danger if you're trying to hike up that high in May or really early June if it's a very high snow year. So of course, there's different things that impact how much snow there is. Like some years I've been able to do 14ers without seeing any snow in June and even into May. I did Pikes Peak on Memorial Day 2 years ago, but that was a very different snow year where we basically had a drought, hardly any snow that year, and so it was kind of an anomaly. On the flip side, there's years like in 2019 where we had a ridiculous amount of snow that caused an absurd amount of avalanches, and so there was avalanche debris and the snow stuck around well into July. Like most people didn't start long distance hiking or backpacking until halfway through July, which is, much later than normal. So it's important to read the forecast, maybe join some local groups, ask around, and find out how much snow is actually out there when you're planning your trips. You also need to know that the aspect of the slopes makes a difference. So if you're planning a day hike, then this is a little bit easier, but south-facing trails and south-facing slopes tend to melt out and dry off a lot faster than north-facing slopes. And you can see some of that in some of the pictures from my trip last year where there's huge patches on some slopes, but then you turn around and it's completely snow-free in the other direction. The other thing, of course, is elevation and areas. So again, contrary to popular belief, it's not just one giant thing of mountains in the middle of the state. We have different sub-ranges like the San Juans, the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, the Elk Mountains, the Front Range, the Zircles, Coachetopa Hills, etc. And in between a lot of those, there's a lot of different valleys. So we have North Park, Middle Park. A lot of you have probably heard of South Park. There's also the San Luis Valley, and those tend to melt out much faster just because they're a lot lower in elevation. So for example, if you're looking for a place to visit in late March or April or May, then you might want to consider going to the Great Sand Dunes because it's located in the San Luis Valley. You might still get snowed on, but it's not going to stick around. It's going to be a bit warmer. And honestly, it's probably almost a better time to visit than in summer when it gets really hot. Latitude also makes a difference, so how far north or south you are in the state. So this one kind of, I think, is more important in the fall than it is in the spring because the San Juans always pretty much take a long time to melt out. But it does seem like we get more bigger snowstorms in the northern part of state in the fall before we do in the southern part of the state. It just depends on the year, but this does kind of come into play when you're looking at amount of snowpack, even in the summer, because a lot of times it will vary depending on the part of the state. So for example, sometimes the San Juans have a drought and the rest of the state doesn't. There's more snow on the San Juans than there is on the Front Range, that kind of thing. So kind of be aware of what area you're thinking about going and visiting or that you'll be hiking through. So now you might be thinking, well, if I can't start hiking until early July, if I don't want to deal with any snow, then does that mean we have a longer hiking season? And I'm kind of sad to tell you that's not the case. I met this guy in Canada that once made this statement: we don't have time for switchbacks. Summer's only 3 months long in Canada. And while that is definitely true, and that's definitely true, same thing here in Alaska, that is also definitely true in Colorado. So even though Colorado is so much farther south than Canada and Alaska, the mountains are very, very high, right? Like really high in elevation. Because of that, our season for hiking is very short. So for a lot of people, it doesn't start till end of June, beginning of July. Usually it goes until September, mid-October. Depends on the year and the area. Usually we will get snow sometime in September. I have hiked 14ers and several inches of snow on Labor Day in the past, but typically that snow will melt because the sun is nice and strong. It'll snow a couple more times, it'll melt, and then it'll start sticking sometime mid-October, depending on where you are in the state, usually in the northern part of the state, and then definitely start sticking in most of the state, southern part of the state, by November, end of November, depending on the year and the amount of snow. I have hiked like around Durango with no snow and snow-free trails at the end of November before, but I, again, have also hiked in snow in September. So it just depends. Keep an eye on the forecast for the snow as well as after the snow to see if it's going to be pretty sunny to melt it off, and then adjust your plans from there. So there are different resources that you can use to help check how much snow there is if you are planning your trip for this upcoming summer or any summer. There's things like Postholer and Snowtel. I'm going to make that as a separate video, so if that's something you're interested in seeing, just again, let me know in the comments, and I'll be sure to make that happen sooner rather than later, but do keep an eye out for that video as well. And then if you are looking for more information about hiking in Colorado because it's your first time, then I would definitely check out this video next. It's all about monsoons in Colorado and how to be safe hiking above tree line so that you don't get struck by lightning. Now that's all I've got for today. I'll see you over that video and have happy trails.